Thank you very much for coming to our last session today. This is panel discussion number 2, and we have invited 4 distinguished, relatively young researchers and professors working in the United States, and they are the products of the hybridization of 2 cultures and the 2 educational systems. And probably it is very worthwhile to listen to what they have to say, and probably they know best about both Japanese and American education institutions and systems. So let me introduce the 4 panelists in this session. From my side, Dr. Yuko Butler from University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Kohei Honma, a visiting fellow at the National Institute of Health, and Dr. Hiromi Ono, visiting scholar at the UCLA, and Dr. Yuki Tatsumi, senior associate at the Henry L. Stimson Center. So, Dr. Butler, shall we start?
Thank you very much, Masa. My name is Yuko Butler from University of Pennsylvania. Well, first of all, thank you very much for staying. I know this is a long day, and I really appreciate your participation. And second, I'm not quite sure I'm qualified to be a young person. But since you categorized me as a young researcher here, so I decided to take this opportunity and pretend to be a young person today. Let me introduce myself to you first. I received all the education in Japan until I finished my bachelor degree, and so I'm qualified to be called Junjapa. That's the term that a lot of Japanese young people nowadays want to use, and its literal translation would be pure Japanese, those who have been in Japan and never been abroad for extended period of time before they finish their college. So I think I'm typical Junjapa in that respect. I'm currently associate professor at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. My specialty is teaching and learning English as a second or foreign language among young learners, and then also language assessment. I have involved in a number of projects looking at the introduction of English at the primary school level in select Asian countries, including China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. I'm also the director of a master's level TESOL program. TESOL stands for Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages. So I'm directing a program which basically trains English teachers or teachers to be from all over the world. We have about 150 students, and I would say approximately 70% of them are international students, mainly coming from mainland China, Taiwan, and South Korea. That shows you their enthusiasm about English teaching in those countries. Now, when it comes to Japan, unfortunately, last 4 or 5 years, we did not have any Japanese students, and currently we have none. So that's my concern. And so basically today, I was asked to make some suggestions for facilitating international research collaboration based on my personal experience. So I must say that my experience is quite limited in terms of humanities and social science fields only. So I understand that situation in the science field might be completely different. Before I'm going to make some suggestions, let me briefly describe the general climate of research activities at universities in general. As we mentioned already, the number of students from Japan has been decreasing, and so has our program. Part of the reason is that the number of application from Japan has been decreasing, but at the same time, in our program, their English proficiency is not good enough to be accepted by our program. So that's also my concern as well. And among American students and also non-Japanese students, the number of students who are interested in Japan and would like to go to Japan to teach English, the number of these students also has been declining. We occasionally have formal JET participants in our program. But after receiving a degree from the program, hardly any of them will go back to Japan. This is also very unfortunate phenomena, which I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to come back to this issue later. Now, university as a whole, I think professors and researchers in general, the level of their interest towards Japan has been also decreasing as well, in my view. And at the same time, we have fewer opportunities to get funding from the US to studies on Japan. So that's the general climate. So based on that general climate, my first suggestion would be, this is very simple. We need more opportunity to get funding from Japan, including some sort of assistance for formal JET participants as well. As I mentioned to you earlier, that we occasionally have formal JET participants, but hardly any of them will go back to Japan. This is very unfortunate in my view because they have a great hands-on teaching experience in Japan. They have a good insights about challenges, difficulties, and also possibilities and potentials that Japanese English language education might have. But they're also serious enough to come back to a graduate program like ours and try to learn more about English teaching so they have a good foundational knowledge, like theoretical and practical knowledge about English education and English teaching, but they don't go back to Japan. This is very unfortunate. And then part of the reason is that they don't have assistance to go back to Japan. So it'll be really wonderful if we have some sort of assistance or systems for them to go back to Japan and utilize their abilities and resources. And earlier, our ambassador was talking about a plan to sending our junior high school English teachers to the US and other English-speaking countries. I think it's an excellent idea. And in fact, this is something that many Asian countries have been doing already in a massive, massive scale. I have to repeat massive again, because they're doing it really seriously. And in some way, I mean, it's kind of too late to even start talking about it. Not just junior high school English teachers, probably it will be great if we can send high school English teachers and also primary English teachers or primary teachers who are interested in teaching English as well. My suggestion would be to send these teachers not to just universities or English language programs, but also to schools in the States or other Asian countries or English-speaking countries, to learn about the challenges that these teachers are facing with respect to diversity and multiculturalism and so forth. In my view, Japanese teachers need to be aware of the diversity issue more. People tend to think that Japanese society is monolingual society, but it's not true, and they're facing more diversification in their classroom. I'm not just talking about racial or cultural diversity, but also different kinds of diversities with respect to, for example, socioeconomic status and so forth. So it would be a great idea if we can send our teachers to schools in different countries. That's my suggestion. My second suggestion is something to do with restriction about the Japanese grants, many Japanese grants have. So the Japanese grants, for example, Kakenhi, that's a grants in aid for scientific research funded by Ministry of Education. They have a way too many restrictions with respect to how money should be spent. So foreign researchers can be research collaborators, but it's very difficult for them to have any substantial or meaning participation in a collaboration, largely due to the restriction of the money allocation. So it's often, many people actually invite foreign researchers to Japan and ask them to give a talk, but beyond that, it's very difficult to do something more substantial. I myself have been a research collaborator for many Kakenhi projects, but I couldn't do much because I need to support my graduate students and so forth. We need money to collect data and then do things together. So my suggestion will be to have more flexibility in terms of how money should be spent so that the foreign researchers can be a real co-PI in the collaboration so that they can actually collect data together, analyze the data together, and present the results together. And then even cover the expenses for graduate students and so forth. So that's my second suggestion. My third suggestion is something to do with an assistance for network building. If you want to do research, I think networking is one of the very first and critical steps. You need to get to know people who share the similar interests. And a lot of universities in the States, leading universities in the States, have some sort of the assistant programs where their faculties can take initiative at the networking phase. The idea is that if they can take initiative at the networking phase, then more than likely they can continue to be a leader of the successive projects. So it's a quite good investment to have at the beginning of the research projects. And University of Pennsylvania, the Provost Office has a program called International Initiative Funding, and they give you not just financial help, but also various kinds of assistance. And for example, if you're interested in going abroad, then they can introduce the Alumni Association and their networks and so forth. And I myself received one of those grants, and then as a PI, and tried to take initiative to create networks among researchers who are interested in education for language minority children, immigrants and migrants in East Asia. So the University of Pennsylvania at this point has 4 major regions of focus. One is China, second is India, and South America, and Africa. And unfortunately, Japan is not one of them. But part of the reason why we have a lot of issues, a lot of activities going on in India and China, because their governments are so active and approaching us. So I really want to see that the Japanese government is doing similar things as well. And so I'm just wondering that, say, for example, if Japanese companies are interested in going abroad and do some business, there is an assistance like JETRO, Japan External Trade Organization, is going to provide them with various kinds of assistance, and it would be nice to have an academic version of JETRO as well. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Butler. Very concrete suggestions. Thank you very much. Okay, next speaker will be Dr. Homar.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the USJI and Professor Ino for inviting me. I'd like to introduce myself for the first time. After I've got PhD at Keio University, I had worked at a Riken Institute, Rikagaku Kenkyusho in Japanese, and when I was there, at Riken Institute, there is a kind of a 5-year rule. Postdocs have to find the next job within 5 years. So I was looking for next job there. Then one day I attended a small international meeting for eye development at Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. Then I've talked with my current boss for the first time. Then we discussed my project, and I believe he was interested in my experimental skill. And at last, he suggested me to join his lab. Actually, I had another candidate laboratories in my mind, but finally I decided to come here because I was so glad to get the word like that. So then I found my choice was right. I'm very happy to be here. And then I was working at the Riken Institute, that is the quasi government institute. And now I'm working at NIH, that is government institute. And then I noticed some different points. And generally, Japanese researchers work hard until late night. And NIH researchers, of course, work hard, but come home earlier and spend their time with family. Actually, I think that is a work-life balance. I cannot say what is right and what is wrong, but I suppose that is one of the reasons why Riken researchers are single. Then now I'm in NIH. Then I've noticed many NIH researchers are married. And now I'm in minorities. So in association with this point, in Riken Institute, there are few positions for senior researchers. Most senior researchers are principal investigator, PIs. That means lab head. The other staffs are young technician or postdocs. Then otherwise, at NIH, there are many senior scientists and staffs working, and they participate in the administration or important core of the project. So actually, I think the US people may not care the age, but do respect their experimental skill and experience. So Japanese young scientists know the hopeless situation in Japan. So when they feel they cannot be PI, they have to give up their research position. Then they have to find another job, even they have the PhD degree. So actually, that is the in turn discourage the young students from being scientists. I believe. Actually, I cannot recommend scientists as a job. So, by exchange the research culture, I hope the Japanese situation may change to that decent Japanese decent researchers who may not great can continue their research in future. Then the comparison. Actually, I'm at NIH, so you know the NIH has huge budget, so scientists can focus their research. Of course, their boss have to care the money. And of course, also there are a lot of meetings at NIH. There are many excellent, great scientists present their recent study every week. That is a huge merit for the scientists. And they can contact with them directly at the meeting. And also they can contact with Japanese Researcher Society. Actually, I'm one of the organizer of Kinyokai, that is Friday meeting in Japanese. So that is, Kinyokai was started as the conference for NIH researchers, but now the participant, not only scientists, come from DC and Maryland area. We are trying to connect the research communities such as Pennsylvania and Boston. So, and demerit is the, I think they may lose their connection with the Japanese society. That is the, I mean, physical contact is, I mean, face-to-face meeting is very important for maintain the connection. So I think the, researchers in Japan would have more opportunity for next career in Japan. So the, actually, I think that the situation is the same in US. We had researchers in US have to contact with US researchers, of course, in English. So that is the, I think that is we have some weakness in expressing myself, and so the, I mean, native researchers may may have more advantage in expressing themselves and for their study. So my point is the merit in US is the connection. The demerit is the connection. So suggestion, sorry. Actually, I would go back to Japan next year. So the, as a scientist, I would like to keep in touch with US researchers, and maybe I would invite them to the conference in Japan. Then actually that is a huge merit to of working at NIH and or in US. So and when I came to US, I was very I anticipated intense competition in the research, but because that is, I think, I thought that is American capitalism. So, but that is not true. US researchers prefer collaboration rather than competition. Then yes, then US researchers do know each other, know their potential competitors' work very well. So the, they are always trying to avoid the conflict. So the, I was so surprised to realize that, and I think that is reasonable, because the, too much competition may waste the time and the manpower and money. So I think the US people are always trying to do with a reasonable way. Of course, there should be a competition to some extent, but I believe too much competition is not good for research, because they may pursue the short-term quick result rather than long-term important aspect. So I hope the Japanese government may, I hope the Japanese government would encourage the international and internal collaboration in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Homer, for insights on the U.S. research environment. Okay, next speaker will be Dr. Ono.
Hi, thank you for having me here. I am, I think, not the Jun Nihonjin or Jun Japa. Jun Japa de wa naku. I actually came here when I was a senior in high school for family reasons, and it was probably one of the more difficult times to move to the U.S., in part because I had no idea how the American college entrance system worked. I didn't know the language. I was on my way to getting into college in Japan, so it was an entirely new experience. And the only reason I think I got into college was because there were all these AP programs that were math-oriented, and that was one language I could understand. So reluctantly, I was a math major that didn't really like math, and I became a soc major at the end because I didn't really like math. And my undergraduate teacher, who happened to be one of the leading trainers in sociology at the undergraduate level, took me under his wing. We spent 2 hours every day sort of training me to be a sociologist for about 2 years. So I sort of, despite my father's extreme resistance against, because he's, Japanese, he has no idea what sociologists do. He fought and fought, but I fought even harder, and I was on my way to become a sociologist. I got my PhD from UCLA. I'm a demographer, so I also have a master's in demography from Berkeley. So I sort of, that's my background. I was at the University of Michigan at the Institute of Social Research, where I worked primarily with economists, and I spent many years there. And again, for family reasons, I had to move back to the state of Washington, where my family is, and I ended up in a sociology department, tenured, and so on. So I had a career as a professional sociologist for many years. My work was, I really wanted to do work on Japan. However, in my discipline, there are not very many positions in Japan, and they all seem to have gone to China, and so as Goto Sensei had, Batra Sensei had noted. And so as somebody who's trying to make a career out of being a Japan scholar, it's nearly impossible. And so I started doing some work on the US, and which then led me to do a lot of comparative work, which then led me to get fellowships doing comparative work. That then took me to do a couple of years at University of Tokyo at Institute of Social Science, ISS. So I had other fellowships as well as JSPS fellowships to do that. So that was my career prior to coming to DC about a year ago, where I now work at the Department of Education and sort of managing the post-secondary education program there. So that's kind of my background. In terms of my sense of sort of Japan and US research now, at Michigan I was a research professor, so I had quite a bit of experience doing research, and my impression really at top universities here is that research is the main thing, teaching is a side gig. That's changing, of course. There's a lot more demand on the quality of teaching, especially at, there's always been some pressure, I think, at private schools because, students do have a lot of say in, because tuition is a huge base and so on. But now at public schools as well, accountability is becoming more important. I know that Homa Sensei mentioned the sort of, sense that maybe the competition isn't very stiff. My sense, again, because I was working on the grant side of things, and I was trying to survive as a Japan scholar, my sense was that the competition was just incredible. And also, because you don't have that many people who do work in Japan, in your discipline, you kind of end up being an island of your own when you end up doing work on Japan. So, you don't really have this luxury of forming teams and, you want to, but there's no one around you who will, be able to do what you do. So it is a struggle, I think, for people who are now trying to cut out a career as a Japan scholar. So another thing is you got to be able to write well. And of course, as somebody who's had a background, growing up in Japan, and this is your second language, to be able to keep up, if you're trying to do mainstream work in the US or, in Japan, on Japan, sort of competing against scholars who are, whose native language is English, it's a really tough job. And, Homa Sensei also mentioned sort of the life work balance. That's all gone, because you're spending your hours editing your paper. I mean, day in and day out. I had no holidays. I had no weekends, no evenings, because you're writing, even if it's, 80% as good as theirs, it adds up over the time, and so you're constantly on a treadmill and, for reasons that wouldn't be there if you kind of grew up with, English. So it really is a sacrifice, and you don't realize that until you kind of get to a level where, you've accomplished a lot, but then you realize how much sacrifice you've already also made in order to get there. And so, I think people kind of need to be aware as they kind of, think about these options and possibly provide support if there are any that is available. And as Butler Sensei said, I think one of the challenging things about people who are doing work on Japan is that this whole sense of why Japan is not there anymore. It used to be Japan was the leading economy, there was this huge sense that Japan was incredibly important to study. And now somehow China's getting into the edge and Japan is kind of going in the shadows of China. And so the mere justification of, existing as a Japan scholar has become harder. So I think there needs to be a fundamental, fresh, new look at this whole question of why Japan. And also, there needs to be more jobs available for people who do work on Japan. I mean, for all the reasons we already mentioned, Japan positions are disappearing. And so we end up, let's say I end up training students, PhD students, to do work on Japan. They have no jobs. And that's just, in my view, not such a great thing to do. So, there has to be some support. Another experience I've had now, as somebody who did work on Japan in the US, I used to host scholars from Japan. And oftentimes they would come, and they were mostly young economists from, you know, like major public universities in Japan. And they often didn't really have the independence that's required to do research in the US. So you end up hosting them, expecting them, there's an elaborate agreement about what's to be done, but they come over here and they really can't do it on their own. And I don't know whether it's because the system, the PhD system itself is relatively new in Japan, and in a way that emulates that of the US. You know, the tenuring system is relatively new in Japan as well. So there's just this like mismatch between, you know, the people, the institution, and the new system. It doesn't seem to be perfectly matched yet. And so I've struggled with hosting a lot of the young scholars that come to the US to integrate them into sort of the expectations of the level of research that goes on in the US. And so there needs to be maybe a little more of a preparation process that better connects, you know, international research collaboration. So yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ono. Very insightful views, different views on the research environment in the United States. And the last speaker in this panel will be Dr. Tatsumi.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this panel. I know it's a long day, and then our panel is between you and your reception, so I also look forward to more exchanges. So I keep my comments short. Thank you also, Professor Ino, for upgrading my educational experience. I only have master's, I don't have PhD, so therefore I don't have a doctor, but it's always nice to be called, even though by mistake. And I'm one of those master's students who completely missed the window of starting a PhD. And now with a married and a family and a house and mortgage and all that, it's gonna be a long time away before I can even think about going into PhD, although that remains to be my distant goal sometime before my retirement comes. I'm a little bit of an anomaly on this panel. Remainder of all my preceding panelists all have PhDs. Their back training is primarily in academic realm, whereas mine, my master's is from a School of Advanced International Studies here at Johns Hopkins in DC. That's more a public policy related degree, and most of my alumni will go on to either public policy, research institutions, or government services. So I'm an anomaly from the rest of the panel in that sense. And little personal background, I consider myself very much of a product of a Japanese primary and secondary educational system, but a product of American higher educational system. I did my undergraduate degree in International Christian University, that's in Tokyo, but for all intentions and purposes, that whatever the academic training that school offers is American as it can get, given that it's located in Japan. So I really don't count my experiences at ICU as one with Japanese universities. And then also the greatest impact my education had on my professional life since I finished my master's is really coming from my graduate studies at SAIS. So I really consider myself as a product of this hybrid, of this different educational level of the two different countries. And also, as far as my professional life is concerned, I consider myself very much of an American product. You would not find a woman who has no military background doing research and analysis and publish books on Japanese military or Japanese defense policy in Japan, period. It can only be done in the United States. So I consider myself for that. Dr. Butler gave me a great, I was actually struggling a little bit to how to frame my remarks this afternoon, and listening to Dr. Butler, she gave me an excellent template. She gave me the whole lay of the land for what the research university environment is like for the, if you're teaching in universities, training upcoming students who would like to focus on Japan or who would like to go off to Japan and teaching English or do whatever. So I thought I would just give you a parallel picture in the Public Policy Research Institute. General environment in what you call think tank in the United States, specifically in Washington, D.C., is that they're mostly qualified as nonprofit organization. That's a tax code 501c3, as we like to call it. And oftentimes, in those institutions, you fund everything by yourself, including your salary, your office rent, your computers, your phone services, whatever. And you get the funding from, generally, roughly speaking, 3 different sources. One is for grant-making foundations, which I will talk about in a minute. There's a huge difference in grant-making practices between American foundation and Japanese foundations in policy works. So I'll go to that after I give you this general overview. The second is the corporate donations. There, I would also tell you a little bit of a big difference between Japanese corporations and American corporations. And the third is government research grants. For a public institution that focuses on foreign policy or national security policies like my institution, that government agency means State Department, Department of Defense, and sometimes intelligence community. And that leads to certain restriction as a foreigner competing in the think tank environment also, which I will also touch upon a little later. So that's the general environment in terms of funding for the think tank in general. Doesn't matter if you have Asia program or if you're only focusing in Middle East. If you're a 501c3 public policy research institution, that's the environment that you have generally in front of you. And if you are trying to make your names out there as a Japan specialist in any of those think tanks, I would say, I would echo my co-panelists here that circumstance is incredibly difficult. First of all, each think tank, if there is at all, have one Japan person as a senior associate, senior fellow, and one research associate, research assistant that supports that senior person, and usually non-paid intern. That's the basic structure for programs, for think tanks that has Japan programs. Some of the programs doesn't even Japan have a program at all. They just have an Asia program, and whoever focuses on East Asia kind of does everything, Japan, China, Korea. For amongst us who mans a Japan shop in our respective institutions, our relationship with each other is a little bit interesting and a little bit complicated. In a sense, we all share interest in a very finite, similar set of issues. So we form a very close-knit community. Professional colleagues often becomes personal friends. We mingle at family barbecues and things, but at the same time, we have intense competition amongst ourselves for funding. And usually, if your institution doesn't have an endowment that supports you for your general operating budget, that means your office rent, your basic salary, the support for the administrative teams for your institutions. Roughly speaking, $1 of the grant money that you bring in, 40 cents out of that will go to those support for administrative support for your institutions. So you only have 60 cents to work with. That's sort of the general environment for think tanks. And I'm sort of assuming that the situation in university is more or less similar. Some of them are taken away by overhead. It depends on the overhead rate of each institutions. The challenge for the Japan program in general, but more specifically, if you're a foreigner like me, try to compete with the other Japan scholars in other think tanks. Here are some of the main challenges. Usually in a think tank, the scholar in the think tank has a career path that's very integrated with the revolving door, with the turnover of the U.S. administrations. So you'll see oftentimes a senior fellow or senior associate in the American think tank at the turn of the administration goes into the government, do a couple of years as a senior, mid to senior level official, doing actually a hands-on policy work, comes out, become even more marketable as a policy scholar who actually has a practical experience. Of course, if you're a foreigner, you're not part of that revolving door, so there's a glass ceiling right there. So once you reach a senior associate, senior fellow level, like myself, in one institution, you really don't have anywhere to go, other than going, perhaps you may be able to find a better opportunity at the institution that has a better funding situation, that you don't have to raise every penny for your salary, perhaps, or maybe you get to have a more flexibility in terms of the research portfolio that you control. But as long as you're not part of that revolving door system in the United States, there is an inherent limited marketability that you bring to the table as a Japan scholar in DC think tanks. And that is partly because that is actually mainly because a lot of the policy grant giving foundation that focuses on policy really values that in-government experience that each scholar has. So before I started my work at the nonprofit, I had 3 years at the Japanese embassy here as a special assistant at the political section. My title was a special assistant for political minister. I'm using that 3 year at the Japanese embassy at relatively low level as my one and only really precious Japanese government experience that I sell to foundations, and foundations found it valuable. But I'm fully aware that I won't have any more senior level opportunities as long as I'm a part of the US think tank community. So that's one restriction. The other challenge that I have is, since I'm competing with my American colleagues, Japanese media, Japanese corporation, or even Japanese foundation would really like to fund those my American colleagues rather than someone like me. So that's inherent disadvantage that I try to tackle every day. Fortunately, I have a fair number of corporate representative, both in DC and in Tokyo, that really supports my work, so that kind of keeps me going. But without that, I probably would have packed up and left my institution probably 5 years ago. For the grant-making foundations, one thing I would say is that Japanese foundations tend to have way too many restrictions on its funding and budget guidelines for the money that it gives out. I work with a couple of American foundations. There are a couple of them that I usually deal with. They often support my work in my book or other research. Their give amount, their award amount is usually twice as large as those Japanese, as the Japanese foundation, with much fewer restrictions. So at the end of the grant period, all that foundation requires is that you account for every cent of the money that you spent, and as long as you can legitimately explain how you spent those money to those foundation at the end of the grant period, you have a tremendous latitude in terms of moving the budgets around the categories between personnel, travel, meetings, conferences, publications. And you don't have to without a prior approval from the foundations. On the other hand, Japanese foundations, for far less amount, they have a very stringent budget guidelines that makes individual work almost impossible, it makes it very difficult for me to invite other collaborators. So let's talk about travel. Airfares are on the rise. So if you fly to DC to Tokyo, you really cannot get the airfare less than, I would say, $1,800, depending on when you fly. But some of those foundation restrictions, top line for the budget for the DC Tokyo airfare is $1,600. So for something like that, I cannot ask my colleague to take incredibly discount airfare with, backpackers to come to legitimate research proposals. Those are the legitimate scholars teaching at universities in Japan. I cannot give them that treatment. And yet, with the restriction of the foundation grants that's coming from Japan, that's the reality that I'm working with every day. So how would you expect, Japanese scholars more actively involved in research overseas or collaboration with American institutions if there is no grant, if there is not sufficient grant support that supports their work in doing so for legitimate expenses? So those are some of the challenges that I deal with in a think tank environment. And I really don't know whether I can come up with a specific proposal, but I think why Japan question is tremendously important for think tank communities, especially when it comes to foundations and corporate gifts. You have to justify that why studying X issues on Japan is really important for that foundation's goals and purposes. And as Japan as a country lose its dynamic, it lose its energy and vitality, it becomes more and more difficult for the researchers to justify that. So it's really not the issue that are limited to academic exchanges, and it's not something that can have a quick fix by government dumping money on all the overseas PR. But the issue, I think, is more fundamental as we look at Japan continue to become more inward-looking. And as the Japan becomes more and more inward-looking, it's really hard for us to try to sell to our funders, donors, prospective collaborators, why it's in their interest to be a part of this endeavor also. So I'll leave that for food for thought.
Thank you very much for sharing with us some serious issues you as a researcher facing in the United States. So any one of the panelists have some additional comments and the follow-ups? Okay, so then let's take questions.
Thank you. This one? I think following Yuki-san's suggestion, Steve Winters, I describe myself as a backpacker researcher. So I would pose this question. When I was a foreign researcher at Kyoto University, I visited the newly I had a visit as a foreign researcher at Kyoto University to the Narrow Science City, which had just been basically put in operation in those days. And I think since then I read many reviews of Narrow, which are rather critical that it hadn't lived up to expectations. I don't know what's happening recently, but certainly then there was the Scuba Science City. And for instance, we had specific mention of the Riken Brain Institute. Now, when I read the descriptions of that, everything was done to set that up so that the highest level of research standards on an international level would be reproduced at the Riken Institute. So they have a foreign supervisory board, German professors on it, British professors on it. They said, we're not going to let anybody get in there with tenure and not do research, and everything is being, supervised by foreigners, basically, to make sure it doesn't fall back into some second-rate place. And yet, from the description we heard earlier this evening in Riken versus NIH, apparently, at least from that description, it hasn't worked. So are there any general comments on the question, which I've often read articles about, why is Japan unable to reproduce types of research institutions in other countries, even when they try? And certainly, if you look at Singapore, particularly, and China now, tremendous efforts in every way to reproduce foreign research standards.
So the point is that research institute and at NIH, I have no idea about the government government institutes should be a more, you know, the NIH has huge budget for the research, so that, as I said, people can focus on the specific important healthcare issues without carrying the money. So that will be the important point, because we need to take care of the issues. So we all need, of course, general people need this point. So we need this kind of government institute for taking care the this health medical issue. So we need this institute, and another institute should be, as Ono-san said, many institutes competing everywhere. Of course, actually the NIH will be a specialized institute. So yes. So we need this institute, but the other competing institute will be also there. So my point is we need both. We need both competing institute, also government institute. So I can say that exactly.
Well, I just wanted to say my personal observation, and again, it's restricted to the humanities and social science only, so I don't know about the natural science field. But my observation would be there are two things. One is time. So my feeling is that the university professors in Japan seems to have lots of administrative work and administrative duties, and then they might not have much time to do research. And then if you look at, you know, how many times you can have a sabbatical in your lifetime, I'm not quite sure. But, you know, at my institution, for example, as long as I can get some external funding to support myself, to make a, you know, leave of absence for a year, I can leave anytime I want it, as long as the other, you know, faculty members agrees. So the time is one issue. And of course, you need to have time to do research and quality of research. And second is something to do with the accountability system. So I'm not quite, you know, familiar with the accountability system in Japan, but I heard that many universities in Korea and in China started introducing sort of American model of accountability system, where, you know, the people are really pushed to publish a lot. So that kind of pressure might really help them to produce more. I mean, they have no choice but produce more. So again, I'm not quite familiar with the accountability system at Japanese universities, but my impression is that they might not have the similar type of accountability system that we have in the States, which I'm not quite sure that's the best way to go, which is going to be a completely different discussion, but that's my observation.
Yep. And I do think that they are starting to, you know, incorporate a U.S.-like tenure system at leading universities in Japan too, but it's still at its early stage. Also, there's cultural factors. I don't think undergraduate education or education in general tends to kind of breed a lot of independence, or maybe it's a cultural thing, I don't know. And research and ideas in what makes the U.S. one of the big breeders, I think, of these things is that there is a culture of independence. And so ideas, and, you know, they tend to mow forward with whatever ideas they get, while in Japan you may have to kind of tame that. You know, if you have a certain thing that you just want to go forward with, you may have to check with everyone around you first before you kind of take that on, while in the US it tends to be a little more encouraged. You know, a lot of my colleagues who got their PhDs in the US and then went back to Japan to teach complain about their PhD students because they're used to kind of dealing with students who tend to really want to, they have an idea on what they want to do, they want to move forward, and like nothing else matters. While they go to Japan and they're waiting on the students to come and tell them what they want to do, and they never do, and you know, they have to almost kick their butt to like get them to move forward. And so I think it's the newness of the system. There is just a mismatch yet at this time, I think, with sort of, you know, how students are brought up at earlier, you know, parts of the educational system and fed into the PhD programs. It's just, I think, a phase of growing at this point.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a fascinating discussion. My name is Shigeki Komatsubara. Actually, I'm neither academics nor researcher. I'm working for United Nations and coming from New York. It's been a wonderful opportunity to really refresh my thinking. I'd just like to offer a few thoughts. Actually, it's been very interesting to hear that the interest in Japan study has been declining. But I tend to think that actually Japan has more to offer than just Japan study. But I think some of the strengths Japan has not been well communicated and has not been really appreciated by people abroad. So that's where actually my comments come from. You know, it would be wonderful for more people to get interested in Japan and have more Japan studies. But beyond that, I think one of the potential reasons for people to come to Japan is Japan has something to offer at global scale. And how can Japan communicate those strengths effectively to the global community, be it academic, be it scientific, be it international organization, and so on? I think that may offer another venue to really open the window for more people to come to study something that happens to be in Japan. So I think that could be another perspective. And talking about communication, I think some of you already mentioned that Japan kind of operates in different ways, or maybe in different languages. Even if you translate Japanese into English, maybe it's still difficult to understand the way Japanese system works. I'm outside of academic world, but I'm wondering to what extent there's effort in Japan to really standardize. I have business background, so I talk about standardization. Of course, I think research depends on the initiative, leadership, and talent. But when it comes to, for example, basic undergraduate education, I still think that some of the Japanese syllabus and curriculum will be very difficult to understand or comprehend if you're pursuing teaching career in US or maybe in UK or in Europe. University entrance exams, my kids are doing international baccalaureate because that's the only globally available standard. I know there are more universities in Japan who are accepting those in globally recognized standard, but maybe US has SAT, SAT, Japan has its own center exams. But in terms of teaching, probably it would be useful to assure people abroad that certain courses have unique standard sets of contents and expected standards for passing the grade. I wonder if that's the same for the graduate school, but you know, in terms of getting the message out and enabling people to come to Japan, I wonder on the Japanese side to what extent there's an effort to make things kind of easily transferable, so to say, between institutions. Maybe English is one of those standardization too. Lastly, from UN, I'm talking in my personal capacity, but I really, some of the remarks you made struck me. Especially, I think the Japanese universities, there are more and more examples of, say, former ambassadors or bureaucrats resigning the ministry and becoming professor. I think that's a good thing. Having said that, I really don't see a kind of, like you said, revolving door, kind of mid-career professionals enriching each other by moving from research to academics, academics to the real business or politics or international organization. I think that is serious limitation factor in really enriching the quality of Japanese education. When we talk about globalization, I think faculty has to convince students that there's more good going abroad than staying inside. If they are not tested globally, how can they convince their students that, well, okay, these are pros and there's are cons. But from my experience, you find more good trying yourself and going abroad than staying in Japan. I think I'm not denying that there should be a kind of academic career path. I think it's important. Having said that, even to enrich that academic career path, I think we are missing so much by compartmentalizing ourselves and really refraining from talking to each other. So I would love to actually have like mid-career business person teaching their experience, maybe not so academic, but their experience at the undergraduate school, or academic people coming to the company, work it out their theory for 2 years, go back to their research. Just like you said, maybe it could be government, maybe it could be international organizations. But I just don't see it happening with a Japanese, kind of compartmentalized society. And I really wish that the Japanese higher education really opens itself up to different talents. And especially for mid-career people, because I'm mid-career too. We are all mid-careers. I think panelists are mid-careers. Because that would help everybody's career. Not that, getting somebody who's done, but who has more to bring back to their work, their society, and to the teaching professionals. I think that compartmentalization is something we really need to work on. I think if Japan is to really become, say, global and compete at global level. Thank you very much.
I totally agree about that because, as I said, if we the student go abroad, when the student go abroad, I suppose they cannot go back to Japan, of course, because the compartment of the academia. So that is the the interaction with the other society will be very important. I agree, totally agree.
It's not a question, it's my comment.
No, let me add some comments on top of what you said. Other than saying that I very much agree with a lot of what you said, my experience at ICU really convinces me that. When Dr. Butler said, described herself Junjapa, I thought the ICU vocabulary had transported in there, because at ICU there are 3 types of students. Junjapa, that's coming through Japanese primary secondary education system, and there's Henjapa. That's often someone who graduate from high school from the United States or other countries outside Japan. But ICU is the only place that recognizes IB or American high school's graduate certificate to start and enroll them into their four-year college program, or graduate from international schools in Japan. And last category, not the least, is non-Japa, which is students from abroad. There can be one-year exchange students, or there were students that does their PhD work and spending part of their Fulbright scholarship time at ICU and so forth. So there are 3 types of students, and that Henjapa category is what the types of the people that you said. A lot of my friends was Henjapa when I was in ICU, and they come from international schools in Japan, many of them. And I asked them about it, and if their parents, their first preference is always to go to American colleges in the United States. But for whatever the reason, whether that may be, it oftentimes, their parents are very concerned that they spend too much of their formative years in American or international environment, that if they don't send their children to Japanese universities, they're going to be nomads. So they really are adamant about their children going to Japanese universities, even if they're currently in international schools. So for someone like that, they only have 2 choices, ICU or Sophia. And there's year-to-year trends, which year ICU is more popular and which other years the Sophias are more popular, but that is reality. And their classmates are going to Harvard, Stanford, MIT, competing in those global environment. So people like that are definitely the victim of the compartmentalized, really rigid certification of the Ministry of Education for the high school graduation. I have a son who's turned 3-year-old. He's probably going to grow up here. I'll probably try to enroll in IB program, which many American public high school offers. That if your child can compete in that environment at the time of graduation, they not only have an advanced placement program, they can enroll themselves in international baccalaureate program. So if they wish, they could take that and enter university outside the United States, maybe in Europe, maybe in Southeast Asia, whatever. And that is not an option for Japanese high school students at this moment. And for more lively interchange or exchanges of just people in general, whether that may be academia, business, government, or think tank folks like myself. Japan's lifetime employment system definitely has its values. It takes care of its employees. It nurtures the loyalty among those employees through their corporation. It definitely has its values, and I don't mean to deny any part of that. But at the same time, it sometimes restricts the mobility of the labor force from one segment of the labor market to the other. And the reason why think tank in the United States works is that there is that extreme mobility within the workforce, and changing jobs, at trying out different things. For example, a scholar going into government for a couple of years, that's considered positive for their career development. Whereas in Japan, I'm not so certain whether that's considered in that kind of a positive light. So issue is really complicated, and it's just not limited to education. But I just wanted to respond to what you just offered.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can take one more question. If there is no questions, then we would like to move on to Dr. Muri's closing remarks.
Thank you very much, panel, distinguished guests. I was asked to say, by way of closing, something that would be a summary of today's work. Well, can you imagine that task? As I was sitting there, I was reflecting on the fact that what I heard from morning until evening today was a remarkable amount of storytelling, narratives, including the concluding remarks we just heard. And it led me back to think about the very plan for today's meeting, which was to come up with a sustainable framework by which we could facilitate, encourage, expand, exchange. And I wondered if any such thing is possible or even desirable, if so many of the stories being told are to be taken as normative somehow, then maybe what we need to do is to create a system of non-systems. That was the first thing that impressed me upon hearing so many of the stories that were told today. But let's go back to the agenda and see if we can come up with something. Let me tell one story of my own first. One of my first official meetings here in Washington came around 1980 when I was at the time working at Columbia as deputy provost. This was shortly after our opening to China, which became a fact after President Nixon's visit there. And very soon, we started to receive at Columbia, as many other universities did, delegation after delegation from the People's Republic of China. And each delegation was fascinating because you could always predict, almost from the start, what you would experience. There would be a variety of ages, but very much skewed toward older, established politicians and academicians. The older individuals very seldom spoke English. They typically were dressed in Mao costumes, whereas the younger ones typically spoke English. They were always a step behind. They sometimes ate in different manners when we received them. But the important thing was that they kept coming, wave after wave after wave. We were quite overwhelmed. Well, we came to a point where the Department of State here in Washington became concerned. It was concerned, above all, about the openness of the research environment in the United States. And they were concerned because these were still the early days of involvement with the People's Republic, that certain trade secrets would be given away because so many of the students who came in, of course, science and engineering, something I'll pick up here in a minute. So they gathered representatives from about 15 or so universities that were the principal spots where the Chinese students were coming for a meeting here in Washington. And we were sort of being called on the carpet, as it were, to say, you have to have rules and regulations. Now, you can't be quite as open as you are being. And you can imagine what academics do when challenged in that way. They said, that's not the way we work. You know, if you want to use universities as a modality for extending openness to China, you have to accept our principles, the most fundamental of which is openness, is exchange of ideas. I was delighted to hear some of the stories about NIH here, and SF would be the same phenomenon. So we pushed back against our own State Department officials at the time, but at the same time, the Chinese ambassador came for our lunch, and he was not at all like the Japanese ambassador, the wonderfully open and delightful gentleman that we heard from today. But he was very sober and very, not at all defensive, but very quiet and discreet. And the questions that we had of him were completely different. And what we were saying was, you know, we were trying to assist Chinese students, and so we hand out certain grants. But we expect those grants to be used by the students that are coming. What's happening is they're collecting the funds and sending them back to China. And that upset us. So here we were upset with our State Department because they wouldn't tolerate our openness. And we were upset with the Chinese ambassador because they seemed to be pooling monies that were intended for students. But what occurred to us as we proceeded that day, and me in the many years since, is that as much as we like to exchange faculty, students, researchers, we are still guided by certain values, cultural values that are quite important to us. And that was threaded through, I think, the discussion today. We've heard several references to that in many direct and indirect ways. Exchange is not always as smooth and as uniform as we think it might be. And we will always have to be attuned to certain cultural differences, even though the disciplines themselves, the fields of study, may be standardized in so many important ways. Still, we are dealing with individual cultures. Why is it a problem for us? Why would we have a meeting here as we did in Tokyo earlier on the problem of exchange, when, as a matter of fact, China, as mentioned, India, Korea, I doubt that they would be having a meeting like this. Why? Because they are succeeding so outrageously in sending so many students abroad. So what is it about US-Japan? Two great economically powerful civilizations. The concern, I believe, is that Japan is starting to feel left behind. That was referred to directly and indirectly, that it feels its smallness somehow. However powerful and big the economy is, it's feeling a bit swallowed up within Asia and perhaps in the world, that it's feeling isolated and it's concerned about looking inward. Well, all of these concerns, legitimate as they are, do have an impact on what kind of forms of exchange could be devised and encouraged. One thing I would caution here is that we not be so overwhelmed by the purely economic aspect, and that we think of the social, the cultural, the political values that have come to be embedded in Japan. Someone referred earlier to the fact that Japan is far and away, I think it was Sheila Smith, the most reliable partner that we have in Asia. And even though that form of relationship, which is so much the topic of this particular institute, may change over time, we have to remind ourselves that very, very important democratic and cultural values are embedded now in Japan that are not precisely there in other countries throughout Asia. Don't be apologetic about it. So don't worry so much about numbers, I would caution, or about the economic aspects, but rely on the fact that a very great society with traditional values wedded to the open values, the democratic values of the West has been achieved in Japan and should be relied upon. That too is a message that has to be gotten out, it seems to me, to Americans increasingly. After our initial infatuation with China, which is not going to go away, I think there is a return to Japan that is taking place in the United States, and we should try to build on that, I believe, in formulating frameworks for exchange. As I say, we were looking for a sustainable framework by which we could cultivate exchanges. But here I would caution, simply because of the narratives and the stories we heard today. Very often the best form of exchange occurs by happenstance, even by accident. A family gets posted to the United States, or some member of the family travels elsewhere and recommends a course of action. Any number of ways in which exchange come to begin, or ideas start to get seeded in the minds of individuals, should be encouraged. And you don't exactly need a program for that. Just pushing people out the door, engaging one another in order to encourage these very informal exchanges can lead to great consequences. And I think we have representation to that right here in today's panel. The hard facts of globalization are not going to go away. We know that. People are going to move across boundaries. Capital moves, labor moves, and ideas are moving. That's not going to go away. It's going to accelerate. The speed of change is probably going to become a major factor for colleges and universities. We are not by nature an institution that changes very willingly or very fast, but I think we're going to have to pick up the speed of change within our institutions. And finally, the forms of exchange will probably undergo considerable alterations as time goes on. The internet is, by everybody's calculation, a major element of change in every sector of the economy. We don't shop the same way, we don't travel the same way, we don't communicate the same way, and we probably will not be educated the same way. That's not something that can be automatically changed, but I think it's going to drive what we do. If we are looking to elements of a framework that would encourage more exchange between the United States and Japan, what would those be? English is an element that keeps coming up in conversation, privately and here publicly. Like it or not, it probably is the world's language, not only in commerce, not only in the arts, not only in sports, but certainly in the academic world as well. So any way in which facility with the language can be encouraged at a very young age, I think we have to build it in. Whatever government programs or individual school programs might devise, I think has to come to terms with that. Calendar was another element that came up. And here I'm troubled because I, like so many, am very fond of the cycle of life, the cultural life, the business life in Japan, shaped around April the 1st and the beginning of that the spring. Somehow or other, those cultural values need to be preserved, but at the same time, packages of time, whatever that might be, that are more in conformance with the rest of the world, now I include Asia as well as the West, will probably have to be devised. And we hope that our colleagues at the University of Tokyo can lead the way on that. The link of education to work is another very important element, I believe, in any framework that we come up with. American students, for good or ill, don't always think about careers when they're in college and university. Their parents wish they would think about it quicker, but we do not. And in Japan, it's very much different. One pays for the choices one makes, whether you study this subject or that, whether you choose to study abroad. We're going to have to be attentive to that and try somehow to loosen up that link, all the while recognizing that it does exist and it will have an impact on how students choose to study abroad or do not, and how, for that matter, those involved in business and in industry do as well. I hear, colloquially, but nonetheless, that students are sometimes disadvantaged, even neglected, if they have chosen an unconventional way to get their degrees in university. Well, if that's the case, then there's a fundamental cultural problem as well as as it were, bureaucratic one that impedes educational exchange. The other is to use research as a basis for exchange. We heard many examples of that, not simply because our speakers often came from science and engineering, but we heard about instances in which programs were being devised around certain issues. In one case, Dr. Williams talked about the program at AIU, in which students from both sides of the world were asked to solve issues, local issues no less. That's in part because of the nature of that university, but very often local issues can impel us in ways that the bigger, more theoretical ones cannot. Once upon a time, we studied abroad to study in a particular discipline, art history in Paris, or economics in Silicon Valley, or whatever it might be. That will continue, but we should conceive of programs as well that are driven by research interests that arise in local environments, as well as the big issues, of course, in global. Students like to ask questions, and increasingly I find they're impatient to get to the problem, the challenge of solving certain problems or solving certain issues. I think we should need to build on that, that if we can cultivate this interest in issues that go beyond the individual or go beyond the individual discipline quite early in their university life, we might better be able to attract them to international exchanges. Mixed methods. We heard not only programs of universities and think tanks here, but also the fact that there is a combination of on-site actual physical exchange of bodies, as it were, across continents, but also the use of online technology. I believe that any kind of successful exchange is going to somehow thread together a variety of methods, and particularly the use of the internet in one form or the other. The last two things I will say here to conclude this are, in many respects, the most important that I heard. One is the need for flexibility. There's a great deal of structure that Japan in particular, and even the United States, have relied on for their success, but we're going to have to lighten up. We're going to have to loosen up. There's no question about it. We're going to have to permit students to move around within their universities, to stop out, to gap somehow courses of study, to not be penalized if they change their minds, to study abroad and yet be able to come back and enter that course into the world of work. Any way that we can encourage governments and universities themselves to be more flexible in the way they're organized and the way curricular pursuit, I think, is to our advantage. And finally, I will say it's important to lead by example. We can say all we want to youth, you must study abroad, this is the way of the future, but the best way we can facilitate it is to get involved ourselves as educators, as members of think tanks, as professionals of any sort, by doing exchanges ourselves, forming collegial relationships with individuals, however informally, and talking about it, reinforcing it, building that into the normal life expectations of youth. And I think if we start to do that very early in our own careers and keep at it as a matter of course and not get swept away by the demands of the moment, we are far more likely to be able to facilitate exchange. This is not a framework, much less one that is sustainable, but they're all things that I heard in the course of today's discussions which I found to be very illuminating and above all exciting because they were driven by passion. So I thank all of you for being here today, and I thank our panelists both here and the one that spoke this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mooney. And this will conclude the entire session today. And the reception is held in the next door room where we had lunch. So please feel to join us for the reception. Thank you very much.